Hello and welcome. I'm Annie's Crafter. Please join me today as I put this 9-patch bows Advent wall quilt together. I got it off of free-quilting.com, one of Annie's Crafts' sister sites. Not only does it have a plethora of holiday quilts, big and small, but also for many other occasions as well. So join me as I put together this beautiful and quick and easy quilt. I am now beginning this 9-patch bows Advent wall quilt, and I wanted to show you before I started cutting all of the fabric that I'll be using and where I got it from. So this set of Annie's Creative Quilters Fabric Club selections, I'll be using all of them except for the black. This I won't be using, but this was released as a kit at the end of 2018, so that's where I gotten this one. I will be using this one that comes in the kit as biased binding, and biased binding I will show at the end. What it just means is that instead of cutting your strips straight across, I'll be cutting them this way. I thought it would add a great focal point to the quilt. And then for the backing, I'll be using this from this collection. This is from the Holiday Quilters Club. This is a very recent kit club that just was in my inbox. I believe it came in October, but here's the selection of fabrics for that. And so this actually is almost a whole yard wide. So this is going to make a great backing. This 9-patch quilt is not very big at all. It's only 22 by 30, so I don't even need more than 3/4 of a yard. Then I've got all of these fabric selections because I do need darks and light. I will be strip piecing these. So I have a great selection of light here and dark. I will tell you that there's another one that I am going to fussy cut just a little bit. It's this one. If you want to preview your fabric to see what it would look like, you can take 2 pieces of paper. I always look at how big I need to cut my strips and move them so they're about 1.5 inches wide, which is about this. And so I decided to be fussy cutting this little strip of fabric that has this really great foliage from the evergreens. I didn't want to get any more of those antlers because you see that kind of looks a little funny when you're doing some square piecing. So we'll just cut this in fussy cut strips of this much and then we'll move forward. I really like these buffalo plaid checks that are included in both of these, in the Christmas Cabin collection and the Snowy Wishes collection. But I did need to pick up, per the instructions, I do need some of these corner pieces and some sashing and some of the borders. And so I went to my favorite local quilt store. Hello, ladies. I just wanted to say shout out to you guys on Peach Street. You guys are fantastic. If you always can shop at your local quilt store, I know that they really appreciate it. And these are the selections I made. I wanted to make something get something kind of neutral because I've got lots of patterns and action going on. Plus, we will be tying on a ribbon and a candy cane as well. So it's going to have a lot of action. I thought we would make it nice and plain. So here are the fabrics. Now, normally, if you were to do a fabric of a quilt of a larger size, I would totally recommend pre-washing the fabrics. But when you're working small, when you pre-wash your fabrics, you lose a lot of sizing and you could get some wonky grains. So I always like to cut the small quilt strips pre-washed. So I'm just going to open them up. I'm not even going to press them, and I'm going to go ahead and get started cutting my lights and my darks into 1.5 inch strips. And once I get that done, I'll come right back and show you the next step. And when you get a very long strip of piece of fabric, kind of like this one, where it's an entire yard that's 1/4 inch long. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that when you're starting to do your strip piecing, you want to slice this in half, especially if there's a pattern here, because if you don't, you're going to have a whole lot of blocks that look the same. So that's just one of those tricks that I learned along the way. So I've cut most of these into around 18-inch strips. Now, because I love a scrappy quilt, but I love an organized scrappy quilt, I've figured out that I am going to make at least 12 combinations using the 4 strips of fabric here and the 3 different kinds of fabrics here. I've just multiplied the 2, and that's about 12 different combinations that I can achieve out of these different kinds of strips. So when you're doing your setting up, usually when I do a scrap quilt, I do actually put down a few of these to see if there's any horrendous looking strip combinations. Okay, so I'm very happy with the ones I've made so far. So we'll set those aside. And then I go ahead and just kind of eyeball and make sure that these ones, the light on the outside and the dark in the middle, are going to look fine just as well. And they do. So I'm going to go ahead and get out my sewing machine and start piecing these together. So let's talk about feet and thread for a moment. I really do most of my piecing with this 1/4 inch seam allowance foot. It really does make a difference when you're putting your 2 pieces of fabric together. You can just butt up against that one little plate on the side. Now let's talk about thread. I always use gray thread when I am piecing things together, except for very few occasions. Let's say if I'm doing a monochromatic red quilt, I would use a mid-tone red. But in this instance, when I've got so many lights and dark grays, I always tend to use a lighter gray. And I'll tell you why. Because when you are piecing together, it is much easier to hide lighter gray thread than darker gray thread. Because if this lighter gray thread gets, let's say, off a little bit on a darker colored fabric, you can always cheat and use micron pens as an addition. You can just write right on over top of your thread and it will hide it so it matches into the fabric. That's one of my quilter's tips for you. Happy sewing! I am strip piecing. I just like to sandwich the 2 together without pinning and using my 1/4 inch foot. Now I always put the darker fabric on the bottom because it's easier to see than the lighter fabric if you tend to get off. If you use a lighter fabric on the bottom, it tends to blend in with your sewing machine and it's not as easy to see when you are off by just a smidge. Yes, these are 1-inch pieces, and traditionally a lot of ladies would normally tell you that you want to press your seam open when you're doing such small work because quilting with that is going to be really difficult. But I will say that if you just press them to the darks on one side, I'll show you how they interlock when we start piecing them together. So I have all my strips now pieced together with a light, dark, light, and then of course with a dark, light, dark. And I have this wonderful tool. It is by June Taylor. It is available probably in your local quilt store and of course online. And what it does is it really does a really fantastic job at cutting lots of things all at once. So you just lay this thing on top and then you can line up the line here, just making sure it's nice and straight. And then you can grab your rotary cutter and then start by inserting it in that hole at the bottom. And then it cuts it at a perfect 1.5 inches, just like what we're supposed to. So the first one is 1.5 and then 3. And if you want to keep going along and you don't know where you're supposed to go, I use these little page flags and I mark every single time if I had multiples all the way down to make sure that I don't miscut, and then I'd have to cut more and sew again. So I'm ready to sew my strip pieces after I've cut them into the 9 patch blocks. And do you remember when I said we're going to press all the way towards the darker colored fabric? Not only does that save on the shadowing on the light colored fabric, what it does is also creates an interlocking grid, which comes imperative in this step. Of course, you can use pins and sew them to pin them together, but if you just stack the right sides together, those interlocking pieces line up so perfectly together, and therefore you just start sewing in your sewing machine. So your result is perfectly lined up squares where all of the corners lined up and you don't have any gaps or mismatches in the corners of your 9 patch. So I have finished all of my 9 patches. They're pressed and ready to go. I've got my darks and my lights in separate piles. I also have pre-cut the red rectangles that will go in between each 9 patch to create a nice long row, as well as my sashing. I've got the green and the red that I will alternate to make a nice row in between each major 9-patch row. Now I will have to say just one little thing about the diagram here. These dimensions you see right here are the finished dimensions of each section. I want you to make sure that when you are doing this, that you read the instructions for cutting, because that is the proper dimensions to cut each and every block in this entire quilt. The other thing I wanted to show you is that I have outlined all of the light blocks here on the diagram for the quilt top, and my gut feeling is that the maker of the quilt put those in random spots just because of the fabric choices she was using. Sometimes when you have these 9 patches, that you need to modify them and put them in a pleasing position before you assemble your quilt top to make sure that it's the most aesthetically awesome as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and lay it out before I start sewing. I think it's coming together quite nicely. I liked how I did the light blocks in certain areas, but I did make sure that I had all of that rectangular stripe going in a diagonal, all the same direction, so it adds some cohesiveness. I have put the sashing rows together, and now I'm just going to go ahead and press and put it all together. Looking forward to seeing what it'll look like. So I'm piecing my row and my sashing together, and obviously I want to pin on either side of this junction here to make sure that those line up perfectly just like my blocks did. Now the only other tip I can give you is sometimes we're imperfection when we do our sewing, and you can see the bottom row for the 9 patches has some sort of gaps in between each pin mark, and you can see that there's a little bit of gappage because those 1/4 inch seam allowances weren't perfect. Now to put that in the machine on the bottom and let the feed dogs gather it together, you put the one that is the true size on top with the larger one on the bottom, and they will all work together in the end. So when I'm sewing these seams together, I do leave my pins in until I've gotten at least 1 stitch into the locked seam. That way I know that those 2 layers are not going to shift as I continue sewing. So I'm going ahead and remove that pin and then allow myself to keep going until the end. And then I get close as I can to the pin towards the edge, then remove it before my needle hits it, and then my edges will line up absolutely perfectly. There's no slippage. So I'm very pleased with the way the quilt top looks. It's very professional looking. I have majority of all of my seams all squared away and put together. So it really is a spectacular feat if you can get all of these blocks lined up. Now the only thing I've got left to do is work on the borders, and I wanted to quickly show you how I work to make sure that, because sometimes our quilting isn't perfect and we have sometimes maybe wonky sides, for lack of a better term, we want to make sure we can square up our quilt. So I will be doing that using our border. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that. So you can always follow the instructions because it will tell you what you need to size your borders to. In these instructions, it says 1.5 by 23.5. I like to do mine a different way. Now, I don't normally cut my borders. If I need to piece them together, which I will have done here with all of my red, instead of cutting a length of fabric to go this way, sometimes you're going to have a pieced border. Now, this pieced border I have just straight across, but you can always do a mitered corner. I may do that in another quilt down the road. For this little wall quilt, I'm just going to go piece these together straight. Now, what I like to do is not only make sure I put a pin right in the center of this quilt. Now, as you can see, if you look close enough, this pin isn't perfectly in the center, but that's okay. I want to find out where the center is, and that's not exactly a measurement. So I just folded this in half, and the center is right there, and I just put a pin in it, and then open it back up. Then what I'm going to do is take a measuring tape or one of these long rulers and really do a great job at measuring the side of this quilt. I am lucky enough to own a 24-inch ruler, and since this quilt fits those dimensions, what I can do is I literally just measure this side, which is exactly 23 inches, and I also measure the other opposite side as well. and it appears that they are perfectly 23 inches. Now, if this side and the other side are not the same measurement, what I do is take an average of them. I just add the two sides together, divide by 2, and that is the exact measurements in which you want to cut your border strip. So in this case, because my sides are perfectly even, I'm going to cut my border strip to 23 inches for each side. But then you're probably wondering, how do I manage working with a border that has a keystone like this one? What you want to do is, once you have this side put on, you want to go ahead and make sure that you have used the manufacturer's directions for this side, add your keystone squares, and then again, like previously, match up those seams here on the side, and then sew as regular. And as soon as that is done, you'll have your quilt top for the inside border done, and then you just repeat the process for the exterior border. So I've laid down my backing with the right side down to make sure that I position the quilt correctly. Now, if you've never basted a quilt before, there's 2 different methods. You can obviously pin through all 3 layers with safety pins. The other thing you can do is use repositionable adhesive. There's also quilt batting spray that's also an adhesive, and what you want to do is peel back those 2 layers, those 2 top layers, gently spray, don't need much, reposition those 2 layers back down and smooth that out, and repeat the process for the top layer. Pull that back, and you don't want to spray on top of the batting, you want to spray on the back of the quilt. As I said previously, you don't need much. You just place that back down and you smooth out, and then you repeat for the other side. Now, you always want to make sure that you want to protect whatever surface that you're adhering on top of. Like the instructions said, I went ahead and I'm stitching in the ditch. Now that means that I am stitching in that seam between where the pressed seam is, and it's on the down valley side of that seam. And I've done all the way around the outside inner border, and then I've gone along these long strips horizontally all the way across and vertically on these sashing strips as well. That makes these squares puff up just so beautifully, and then especially when I get those twine tacked right in the middle, it's going to look like a little pillow, and so I'm very excited. Now I'm going to go ahead and quilt on the outside border right on the edge, and then I will trim the quilt and ready to put the binding on. Finished all the quilting, and I've also trimmed the edges from all of the excess batting and backing. But let's talk about the fact that this is a wall hanging quilt, and I want to make sure every year the easiest way possible for me and my family to hang it is through a wall hanging sleeve. This wall hanging sleeve is about 21 inches by 3.5, and then I've gone ahead and double folded over and sewn on 3 sides, because this last unfinished side is going to be with the binding. Now, it gives me a little bit of a hangover, so when I stick a dowel through it, all I have to do is put a nail here in the wall on this side and on this side, and it hangs up so nicely, beautifully, and straight. I think this bias binding is going to look absolutely perfectly with the scrappiness of the interior while offsetting the plainness of the outside and inside border. I think the bias binding looks absolutely lovely. I've got that ready to go. Now, the last step in the entire quilt is taking some ribbon, or in my case, some twine. I thought it would add a really nice touch to have it look like candy canes, even when there aren't any candy canes on it. And it's just a piece of 12-inch length. Now, the reason I did 12-inch instead of like the instructions for 10-inch is because I know it will unravel on the end. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put a knot on the end of each end of the ribbon, or twine in this case, and that way it won't fray, and then I can go ahead and just take a pair of scissors and trim off the excess. I had such a wonderful time putting this very easy 9-patch Advent wall quilt together. Not only is it going to be gracing my house for years to come, but also my children's as well. Thanks so much for joining me, and see you next time.